Welcome to Restoria, your cozy corner for gentle bedtime stories. My name is James and I'll be your host tonight. Every night, we bring you peaceful tales designed to calm your mind and help you drift off into a deep, restful sleep. So snuggle in, close your eyes, and let the story begin. The story tonight is called Letters from the Sea. Chapter 1. The Mailbox That Faces the Sea. Marin lived alone in the little blue cottage on the edge of the village, where the waves spoke more often than people did. The roof sagged gently like a hat worn too many seasons, and the shutters had long since faded to the soft color of sea foam. But the mailbox white, rust-flecked, and facing the ocean instead of the road was always clean. It never collected bills or newspapers. It didn't even have a house number. But Marin checked it every morning, barefoot in the sand, with her wind-tousled hair and quiet eyes. Most days, it was empty. Some days, there were treasures. Driftwood shaped like birds, sea glass that caught the sun, and sometimes letters. Not in bottles, not rolled into scrolls, just letters, folded neatly, sometimes in envelopes, sometimes tied with string, always handwritten, always waiting on the wet sand like a secret. She never asked anyone about them. In all her years wandering the shoreline, no one else seemed to notice. The villagers waved at her from fishing boats or nodded on their morning walks. But none ever asked about the papers she carried gently back to her cottage, tucked under her arm like a newborn bird. Marin kept them in a cedar chest by the window. The lid creaked sweetly when opened, and the inside smelled of salt and thyme. The letters were wrapped in bundles, organized not by date, but by feeling warm ones, quiet ones. The ones with stars. She never rushed through them. On rainy days, she would make tea and read just one, letting the ink settle like mist in her mind. Some were stories of journeys across mist-covered seas. Some were whispers of sorrow, love songs to those who never returned. Some felt like dreams caught in nets. But this morning, the tide brought something different. It was folded twice, sealed with wax the color of dusk. No name, no date. The paper was smoother than usual, with edges unfrayed. When Marin opened it, her breath caught. The handwriting was familiar. Not recent familiar, deep familiar, like a voice from long ago echoing in a room she hadn't entered in years. She read it slowly. To the girl who walks the waterline. Do you remember the ship made of pine wood and lullabies? Do you remember the hands that held you, salted from the sea? I've been writing for years, but the tide waits until you're ready. There was more. Lines about stars reflected in puddles, about maps that change depending on who's reading them. But it was the last line that stayed with her. I once told you the sea would always bring you back to yourself. Do you believe me yet? She didn't cry. The letter wasn't sad. Instead, she folded it carefully, twice again, and carried it home without a word. That night, she lit a candle, opened the chest, and took out an older bundle. The ones tied with sea blue thread. She found it. The lullaby. A letter she'd read a dozen times before, but only now understood. It spoke of a sailor who left behind stories, who trusted the ocean to keep them safe. It ended with the same line, "Do you believe me yet?" She hadn't recognized it until now. The voice was her father's, and maybe, just maybe, the sea had been waiting until she could hear him. Chapter 2. The Sea Remembers. The next morning, Marin walked to the shoreline with slower steps. The letter from the night before lingered in her mind like a song she couldn't stop humming. She had placed it atop the others, though its paper and ink felt like they came from a different time. A familiar time. The wind was softer today. The tide lower. The sea, it seemed, was holding its breath. She found nothing near the mailbox, not even a shell or a scrap of weed. So she walked further down the beach than usual, to where the cliffs curved in and the sand grew rough with stone. There, half buried beneath a patch of kelp, she saw a corner of cream-colored paper. It wasn't folded like the others. It had been rolled and tied with a bit of blue string. Marin untied it carefully, brushing away a bit of sand. This one began plainly. Chapter 3. Songs in the Foam. The following days brought winds strong enough to rattle the shutters of the cottage and fill the village with the sound of creaking ropes and flapping laundry. Fishermen tied down their boats. Children stayed indoors. Even the cafe by the harbor, usually open to the breeze, pulled its chairs inside. But Marin still walked. Each morning, she pulled her coat tight and stepped out to the beach. Hair whipped across her face, the salt air sharp on her lips. She didn't look for letters now, she expected them. Not with urgency, but with the quiet knowing of someone waiting for the tide to speak. On the third morning, she found a letter wrapped in oilcloth and sealed with wax shaped like a compass rose. Inside, the handwriting was finer than usual, smooth, careful. It told the story of a woman named Isla who sang to the sea every dusk. Not songs with words, just melodies soft, longing notes that danced across the waves. The sea hummed back, the letter said. But only when she stopped trying to listen. Marin read the line again. She folded the letter into her coat pocket and walked further than usual, past the tide pools and the crumbling dock. There, she sat on a driftwood log and looked out at the endless gray-blue horizon. She tried to hum. At first, it felt strange. Her voice caught in her throat. But then she remembered the way her mother used to sing while stirring soup. Tuneless but content. Marin closed her eyes and let the wind carry her voice out over the water. The sea didn't hum back, but it didn't need to. The next letter came 2 days later. This one was different. No wax, no string, just a crumpled sheet caught in a clump of seaweed. Marin smoothed it on her lap, careful not to tear the edges. It was a list. One brass button, a chipped compass, a feather from a gull, the smell of pine on a winter coat, a lullaby, remembered halfway through, a name whispered through a dream. There was no explanation. No sender, no signature, but as Marin read each item, her fingers tingled. She'd found a brass button once, years ago, on a day her mother didn't come home until well after dark. She still had a compass that didn't point north. The gull feather was tucked in her favorite book, and the smell of pine her father's coat. She didn't know what the list meant, but she knew it wasn't random. The letters weren't just memories, they were maps. That night, she laid them out across the floor of her cottage, the bundles unwrapped, the paper curling gently at the corners. She lit every candle she had and sat among them like a ship in the middle of a quiet storm. Some letters mentioned places. The cove where the rocks sing, the cliff with the twisted tree, the hollow where sea stars gather. She'd been to all of them, and the more she read, the more she felt the threads pulling tight. Not answers, but directions. Not a puzzle, but a path. She looked at the empty space on the wall above her writing desk. Then slowly, she began to pin the letters up, one by one, in a circle that widened like a tide pool at low ebb. A constellation. The beginning of something. A letter fell from her lap, caught by the draft of the open window. She picked it up and saw a new line she hadn't noticed before. If you're following, you're almost there. She smiled, eyes wet, heart steady, not afraid, because the sea was singing, and she had finally started to sing back. He loved the sea more than it loved him. It was short, barely a paragraph. A memory of a man with a crooked smile who built toy ships from driftwood and sailed them in rain puddles. A man who whistled old sailors' tunes even when there was no wind. A man who, the writer said, once whispered stories into the waves as if the sea were listening. Marin felt her chest tighten. She knew the man. Not exactly, but from the way her mother used to speak about her father, she recognized the shape of him, like hearing a voice through a closed door. At home, she pulled the sea blue bundle from the chest again and began rereading old letters with new eyes. She noticed things she hadn't before. Phrases that repeated. Descriptions that echoed the lullabies her mother sang when she was small. Salt in your hair means the sea has marked you. Wind at your back means the sea remembers you. When the tide brings you something, you don't send it away. She whispered the lines aloud. Her voice was shaky, but the words felt like home. That night, as the wind curled around the corners of the little blue house, Marin lit a candle and sat at her desk. She hadn't written anything in years, not since school, but the letters had awoken something. She picked up a pen and let it rest in her hand, then began to write out a reply. Not exactly, but a question. Do you still whistle even when there's no wind? She folded the paper neatly and walked out into the night. The moon lit the sea in silver. She knelt by the shoreline and let the waves nip at her toes. Then she placed the letter gently into the water. It floated for a moment, then slowly drifted away. She watched until it was just a speck on the dark surface, wondering not if it would return, but when. Because she understood now. The sea doesn't forget. It waits. Chapter 3. Songs in the Foam. The following days brought wind strong enough to rattle the shutters of the cottage and fill the village with the sound of creaking ropes and flapping laundry. Fishermen tied down their boats. Children stayed indoors. Even the cafe by the harbor, usually open to the breeze, pulled its chairs inside. But Marin still walked. Each morning, she pulled her coat tight and stepped out to the beach. Hair whipped across her face, the salt air sharp on her lips. She didn't look for letters now, she expected them. Not with urgency, but with the quiet knowing of someone waiting for the tide to speak. On the third morning, she found a letter wrapped in oilcloth and sealed with wax shaped like a compass rose. Inside, the handwriting was finer than usual, smooth, careful. It told the story of a woman named Isla who sang to the sea every dusk. Not songs with words, just melody soft, longing notes that danced across the waves. The sea hummed back, the letter said. But only when she stopped trying to listen. Marin read the line again. She folded the letter into her coat pocket and walked further than usual, past the tide pools and the crumbling dock. There, she sat on a driftwood log and looked out at the endless gray-blue horizon. She tried to hum. At first, it felt strange. Her voice caught in her throat. But then she remembered the way her mother used to sing while stirring soup, tuneless but content. Marin closed her eyes and let the wind carry her voice out over the water. The sea didn't hum back, but it didn't need to. The next letter came 2 days later. This one was different. No wax, no string, just a crumpled sheet caught in a clump of seaweed. Marin smoothed it on her lap, careful not to tear the edges. It was a list. 1 brass button, a chipped compass, a feather from a gull, the smell of pine on a winter coat, a lullaby remembered halfway through, a name whispered through a dream. There was no explanation, no sender, no signature, but as Marin read each item, her fingers tingled. She'd found a brass button once, years ago, on a day her mother didn't come home until well after dark. She still had a compass that didn't point north. The gull feather was tucked in her favorite book, and the smell of pine her father's coat. She didn't know what the list meant, but she knew it wasn't random. The letters weren't just memories, they were maps. That night, she laid them out across the floor of her cottage, the bundles unwrapped, the paper curling gently at the corners. She lit every candle she had and sat among them like a ship in the middle of a quiet storm. Some letters mentioned places. The cove where the rocks sing, the cliff with the twisted tree, the hollow where sea stars gather. She'd been to all of them, and the more she read, the more she felt the threads pulling tight. Not answers, but directions. Not a puzzle, but a path. She looked at the empty space on the wall above her writing desk. Then slowly, she began to pin the letters up, one by one, in a circle that widened like a tide pool at low ebb. A constellation. The beginning of something. A letter fell from her lap, caught by the draft of the open window. She picked it up and saw a new line she hadn't noticed before. If you're following, you're almost there. She smiled, eyes wet, heart steady, not afraid, because the sea was singing, and she had finally started to sing back. Chapter 4. The Compass That Points Home. By the end of the week, Marin had read every letter she owned twice, maybe 3 times. The sea chest stood empty for the first time in years. Only the newest letters, those that had come since the one with the lullaby, remained on the wall. The wind had stilled. The air turned heavy and warm. The village smelled of damp earth and wood smoke, the kind of stillness that asked for quiet. That morning, the tide left no letter. Instead, it left a box. A small square tin rusted at the hinges, with a faded scrap of ribbon tied around it. Marin found it just where the surf line curled around the edge of her boot. She crouched down, heart skipping not from fear, but from the hush of something important arriving. Inside the tin was a compass. Old, but intact. The needle spun once, twice, then stopped not north. Not toward the cottage, but out to sea. Underneath it, a slip of folded parchment. Some things point home, even if they can't explain the way. Marin stood for a long time, holding the compass in one hand, the box in the other. The sea was calm, lapping gently at the sand. A gull circled once overhead, calling out like it knew something she didn't. She didn't go home right away. Instead, she followed the compass, not with purpose, not with direction, just watching where it leaned, step by step. It pulled her to the far side of the village, past the lighthouse that hadn't been lit in a decade, past the salt-bleached posts of old docks no longer used. There, among the rocks, was a small inlet she had never noticed before. It was narrow, with water pooled inside like a mirror. Around the edges, moss grew thick and soft. She knelt, touched the surface. It was warm, and floating in the center, barely visible, was a single sheet of paper. She reached for it carefully. It read, "When you were born, the sea was still. It listened. It promised. It kept your name beneath its breath." She clutched the letter to her chest. That night, she returned to the cottage and sat at her desk for hours. She didn't write anything. She didn't need to. The compass sat beside her, unmoving, settled. She felt it too settled, but not finished. Eli, the boy from the docks, came by with fresh bread. "You look different," he said. Marin smiled. "I feel remembered." He nodded like he understood, though he was too young to put it into words. Before bed, she lit a single candle and opened the window wide. She held the compass in her hands, let the needle spin, then settle, still pointing out to sea. But this time, she wasn't afraid of where it might lead, because she knew something now. The sea doesn't take, it keeps memories, stories, promises made in lullabies, and maybe just maybe, it was time for her to leave a story of her own. Chapter 5. The Story Underwater. The morning came with fog thick, rolling, and quiet. The kind that muffled the sound of everything but the sea. Marin wrapped herself in her thickest sweater and stepped barefoot onto the damp porch. She couldn't see the shore from where she stood, but she could hear the tide breathing. Slow, patient, like it had all the time in the world. She followed the sound. The path was soft beneath her feet, the sand cool. Shapes emerged from the mist, the crooked signpost by the rocks, the white mailbox facing the waves. And there, waiting near the waterline, was another letter. This one was wrapped in oilskin and bound tightly with twine. She recognized the note. It was the same kind her father had taught her to tie when she was little. Inside, the paper was thicker, like parchment. The handwriting was hurried, slanted, but clear. There's a story the sea keeps deep. A story that's not ready to surface until it's remembered. You are the remembering. Marin folded the letter slowly, hands steady despite the way her heart was thudding. Later, she returned to the inlet where the compass had first led her. The fog had lifted, revealing the still pool in its rocky cradle. She sat by the water and looked at her reflection. The sea was quiet today watching. She remembered stories her mother used to tell about her father, how he had sent letters across oceans, how he whispered into shells, how, when he left on his final voyage, he told Marin she'd find him in the waves if she ever needed to. Marin had been too young to understand, too small to hold on to anything but the sound of his humming as he packed his bag. But now, she could hear the tune again. She pulled a small journal from her coat and began to write. Not a reply, but a story. She wrote about the first letter she ever found crumpled in seaweed. The ink blurred, but the feeling whole. She wrote about the dreams that followed, the driftwood shaped like ships, the gulls that circled like they knew her name. She wrote everything. She tore out the pages one by one, folded them tightly, and tucked them into the tin that once held the compass. She tied it shut with new ribbon, soft and green like kelp, and she walked to the water. The sea was still, not waiting, ready. Marin knelt and placed the tin on the surface. It floated briefly, bobbing like a leaf. Then, slowly, it began to drift out. She didn't cry. Not this time. Instead, she stood and watched until the fog rolled in again, covering it like a secret. That night, as the stars came out like tiny lanterns, Marin returned to the cedar chest. She placed the final letter, the one about the story, on top of the others. The chest was full again, not with answers, but with her. Chapter 6. What the Sea Kept. Spring came quietly, as it always did in the village by the sea. The fog lifted. The gulls returned in greater numbers. Flowers bloomed low and shy beside the path to the shore. Marin's cottage stood brighter somehow, the salt-worn shutters catching sunlight just a little longer each day. She spent more time outside now, not waiting for letters or signs, but simply being. The waves still brought things, but she no longer rushed to collect them. She let the tide speak on its own time. One morning, while trimming the herbs that lined her windowsill, she saw a figure approaching through the sea mist. It was Eli. He held something in his hands. "It washed up near the dock," he said. "I thought maybe it was for you." It was a jar, not a bottle, not a letter. A glass jar with a cork lid, cloudy with salt, but inside paper. Several pages, tightly rolled. Maren took it gently, heart rising in her chest. She opened it slowly, and inside were more letters. Not addressed to her, not signed, but familiar. One began, "I saw her walking the waterline again today. She never hurries. She listens with her whole body." Another, "If you're reading this, it means you kept going. That's all I ever hoped for." Maren sat down on the porch steps, the jar in her lap, sunlight warming her back. Eli sat beside her, quiet, waiting. "These feel old," she said. He nodded. "Maybe they just took longer." She smiled. Later, she placed the new letters in the cedar chest, making space where she could. It didn't matter that it was full. There was always room for more. That evening, Maren walked down to the water, a letter of her own in hand. This one wasn't about the past. It was about the present. She wrote about the sound of the sea at dawn, the way the gulls curved in the sky, the hum of the wind against the shutters. She wrote about quiet and memory and the way stories find us when we need them. Then she sealed it and placed it gently on the sand, just where the tide would reach. She sat nearby, knees pulled to her chest, and waited as the waves came in. The letter was taken softly, like a secret being kept, and she felt something lift. Not sorrow, not loss. Something like return. She knew now that not all letters are meant to come back. Some are meant to arrive elsewhere, to carry something forward. Because the sea didn't only remember, it delivered. And Maren had become part of the current. Chapter 7. The Letter That Drifted Back. The sea was calm. Days passed, with sunlight spilling gently across the waves and the breeze moving like breath through the grasses. Maren's steps grew lighter, her gaze softer. She still walked the shore, still checked the mailbox, but the need had quieted. What had once been a search had become a rhythm. And then, on a warm morning, kissed by salt and gull calls, she found a letter she didn't expect. It was hers, the one she had written last week, about the present, about the sound of the sea, about letting go. She knew the fold, the ink, the little smudge in the top corner where her hand had trembled slightly. But something was different. Inside, beneath her own words, a new line had been added. In different handwriting, "I heard you." Maren stood there for a long moment, reading the 3 words over and over. Her heart felt steady and full, like the tide at high swell. She smiled not from surprise, but from recognition. Whoever had added the line, however long it had taken to reach them, they had replied. That evening, Marin lit every candle in her home. She opened the cedar chest, read from the very first letter, and moved slowly through the years. She stopped often to remember, to smile, to breathe. Each letter felt like a stepping stone, each one leading her not away from herself, but toward. When she reached the final bundle, she didn't tie it back up. She left them open, unbound. Because stories don't end, she thought. They just keep drifting. At twilight, she walked again to the sea, not to send a letter, not to wait for one, but just to be. She stood at the water's edge, wind tugging at her sleeves, and whispered, "Thank you." The waves lapped softly in reply, and for the first time in her life, Marin felt not like someone who collected messages from the sea, but like someone who had become one.